go see. Yeah, I can stream starting soon. That's pretty cool. Look how advanced you're getting, James. All high tech, you should be proud. No, I'm serious. It's good. I wouldn't even know where to begin with all this high techness you have going on.
Make it automatic. I can just press a button, it'll do it, and it'll be fine.
Oh yeah. Do you still have that the one I sent you last time, where it's just like the picture of like a DNA strand with you want me to send it? I can resend it. Yeah, just one sec, brother.
No more SpongeBob.
No, I had to retire SpongeBob. A lot of disappointed atheists. Everybody quiet. We could just do the debate this way. Okay, here, I'm about to
It's like fine, where he does the little introduction conversation.
I just went and checked it out. You found it? You found it? Oh. If I can find it first.
Okay, thanks for your patience, everybody. We were just alerted that there was no sound. That's even more embarrassing. But don't worry, it should be starting right now. Let me know if you can hear it now in the live chats. We just made a quick adjustment, and I think it should actually work now. So, very funny. Karag Nightwolf just said, somebody get Kent Hovind on the line. We need tech support. Wow, we still are not coming through. Okay, that's surprising. Oh, we are coming through. Now it's better. So, for the... Somebody's still saying, let's see. Oh, okay. Nephilim Free says we've got sound. If Nephilim Free says it, you know it's true, guys. So with that, Neph, I'm teasing you. It's because, you know, they're all skeptical of you, Neph. So anyway, upcoming debate on God's existence. We're very excited for that. So hopefully you can make it. And with that, we're going to jump right into this. Thanks, everybody, for your patience. It's been a wild one tonight already. But we are going to introduce the debaters. Their links are in the description. So even if you're like, oh man, I don't agree with either of them. Maybe you're a Scientologist. Well, you know what? Tom Jump is going to grow on you. Look at him in the top left up there. Look at that smirk. You just want to... So basically... Oh, okay. Thanks for letting me know the volume is low. We're turning it up right now, so I think it'll be better in a second. Basically, with that, we are going to give Tom Jump an opportunity to just talk about what he's been up to on his channel, and we're glad to have you here, Tom. Thanks so much for coming on. And what have you been up to, Tom?
Thanks for having me on. I always enjoy doing these debates. I'm T-Jump. I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in a God, and I spend time on my channel debating people who disagree with that statement. I wrote a model of epistemology and morality, and all my arguments stem from these two things, and I'm trying to promote them, which is why I do these debates. And I hope you'll come join and subscribe to my channel.
Excellent. Well, that's great. We appreciate you being here, Tom. And thanks for your feedback in the live chat. Oh, it's embarrassing, guys. One day we're going to have a stream with no issues. I promise. It's coming. So next, Standing for Truth is here. And he looks an awful lot like a DNA helix. But he's actually a human. And we're glad that he's here. All right.
You're not supposed to tell people my secret, James.
That's not my wife. That's a picture of her. Okay. All right. So that's an old Kent Hovind line. So anyway, Standing for Truth, glad to have you here. That's not him. That's just a picture of a DNA helix. What have you been up to, Standing for Truth?
James, thanks for having me on. I always appreciate it. It's always a good time. Just the usual, doing discussions. I just had a debate 2 nights ago with a cell biologist. Snake was right. Really good. I recommend everyone go listen to it. Other than that, just like T-Jump said, hopefully people can go over and subscribe. I think there's a lot of fun to be had in 2019. So I'm looking forward to this. Thanks again, James.
You bet. Well, we're glad you're both here. We're not going to take much longer. We will just say, if you're new here, we're glad you're here. No matter what worldview you are, we enjoy your company. So thanks for stopping by. If you want to, feel free to hit that subscribe button, as we got a lot of debates coming up, and we are going to try to run them as fairly as possible. We want to give everybody a fair shake, and so with that, this is my attempt at giving Tom Jump and Standing for Truth a fair shake on creation evolution. We are going to start with 10-minute openings from each side, followed by 40 minutes of open dialogue between the speakers, 5-minute closings, and then a 25-minute Q&A. So I am setting the clock right now. And with that, Standing for Truth, I'm going to start it on your first word. I'm assuming, I know that you guys talked beforehand, but if you have something different other than Standing for Truth starting, that's usually how we've done it, just because usually we talk about, like, is creationism true, and Standing's taking the affirmative. But Tom, if you want to start, that's okay too. And, oh, that's right, we are going to go to full screen. No problem, we can accommodate that. I forgot to set that up, but we will right now. So with that, Standing for Truth, if you are ready, I am going to start the timer, and like I said, you have 10 minutes.
Yep, as long as you can see the screen. You can see my screen?
In about
I can see it.
2 seconds, everybody will. And you are set with full screen.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Let's get right into it then. Origins debate, biblical creation versus evolution. It all comes down to testable and falsifiable predictions. We look to the created heterozygosity hypothesis. At the end of the day, based on the fact that God and his command to be fruitful and multiply, probably didn't want that to be carried out by cloning. We look to this created DNA differences placed into the created kinds, placed into Adam and Eve. So if you have these heterozygous ancestors, that's just a fancy way of saying pre-existing diversity. An almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are possible. And starting with those heterozygous organisms, based on that placement of encoded DNA differences, visible distinctiveness in offspring is going to be quick. With this amazing and designed functional heterozygosity, though, even at a tiny fraction of their nucleotides, through the processes of gene conversion and recombination, so it's not even just mutations. Mutations would provide a little diversity, but it's gene conversion and recombination that we look to, and that would provide essentially an unlimited range of useful diversity that would be produced. And of course, this model makes testable predictions, so hopefully we get into that in the discussion portion. But these design variants would be expected to be created within useful linkage groups and would have originated at high allelic frequencies. And like I said, this hypothesis makes testable and falsifiable predictions. Now, starting from a literal interpretation of Genesis, we can make many other predictions. For example, if we only started with 2 people, all the people today should have a low genetic diversity. And if we started with millions of people, which would be opposite of the biblical creation model, you're going to have a lot of genes floating around a population of 1 million strong. But if you only started with 2 people, Adam and Eve, that really restricts the diversity today. And if the Bible is correct as well, if you're looking at the slide here, looking at the predictions we have made, Adam is our ancestor. There should only be 1 male ancestor of humanity. And mitochondrial DNA, it's this little piece of DNA inherited exclusively from our mothers. Now we can build a family tree of all the females in the world, and there should only be 1 female ancestor. If evolution is true, on the other hand, the pond scum to people type evolution, I mean, those don't have to be true. And Eve, as we know from the Bible, was taken from Adam. And so most genes should come in 2 versions. And this is exactly what we find. And each of the data in this slide are not actually disputed by evolutionists. And this evidence that I just provided is 100% consistent with young Earth creation predictions, taken under a literal interpretation of Genesis. It's too close for comfort for evolutionists. Now, talking about the created heterozygosity hypothesis, we expect change. We expect change in allele frequencies over time, but it's that type of change that we're going to disagree on, because mutations in natural selection, they're going to lack significant creative powers, and there's going to be a limit and a barrier to that change. So neo-Darwinism, that on the other hand, lacks incredible explanatory power in regards to the origin of phenotypic complexity, anatomical novelty, and the origin of non-gradual modes of transition, abrupt fossil appearance, for example. So if by evolution you mean dogs and wolves are related through common ancestry, we're not going to have a problem, because that's expected and predicted under our model of created heterozygosity. But if by evolution you mean dogs, bananas, whales, and pine trees are related through common ancestry, that we're obviously going to have a problem. Now, we look to nested hierarchies. Obviously the design model that I'm talking about predicts nested hierarchies, because since we're made in the image of God, we can then get a sense for what kinds of design patterns God might have used by studying and examining the patterns that result from human designs. And at the same time, we would even predict mosaic creatures, say as is found in the fossil record with such examples, say Tiktaalik, because some products of human design also appear to span 2 categories. It should be obvious and agreeable that boats and tanks would fall into entirely different classes, yet there exist vehicles that blend the features of these 2 different means of transportation. Take an amphibious assault vehicle, for example, which is resistant to classification. This would be the perfect example of a transitional form. This vehicle is designed for the transitional environments between water and land. Even with the invention of crossover vehicles, you look at something like a Dodge Journey or a Ford Flex, resist classification. So it comes down to competing explanations. And as I've shown, genetics confirms a biblical base model. Even post-flood, we would see, based on mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, the LMN haplogroups, they go into these 3 haplogroups, which is completely consistent with Noah's 3 daughters-in-law, which would have repopulated the earth after the flood. So the history of humanity is in our genome. What we know about mitochondrial DNA as well of humans fits the 6,000-year timescale, explains the 3 major haplogroups and the relative differences, the DNA differences that we use to build this phylogenetic tree between pre and post-flood humanity. Now, we can get into objections later if they're brought up, but the testable predictions that we make that are falsifiable in regards to the created heterozygosity hypothesis has to do with functional and non-functional DNA, the non-coding DNA regions. And we know junk DNA, the junk DNA era is dead. It's been overturned. So we'll get into that a little bit more later. Evolution itself has actually been falsified based on genetics, based on a lot of the same genetic data that we're using to demonstrate creation. Now, if you want to look at 2 separate created kinds, we got humans that are said to be made in the image of God, and human and chimpanzees that evolutionists say are related through common ancestry. But if you look at the data that they look at and that they examine, it's based on preferential and selective treatment of data. It's cherry picked. They use sequences that they would expect to be similar. What they don't include is non-aligned DNA, gaps, copy number variations, and size differences. So the actual genetic identity based on these calculations, based on advanced data, is only about 88% or lower. And to put that into perspective, that's over 400 million DNA differences that actually exist between the 2 species. Now, what is the reality? Humans are not apes, and they were created separately and uniquely in the image of God. Not only does the Bible prove this, but so does DNA evidence. Human chromosome number 2, for example, and a lot of this goes back into the junk DNA, which has been overturned. Human chromosome 2, for example, there's a lack of evidence for a cryptic centromere site, and the alleged site where the fusion supposedly took place actually represents a highly organized functional gene. Pseudogenes, shared genetic mistakes that they'll use to build their phylogenetic trees, the nested hierarchies. The thing is, we know very little of the DNA language based on the gold standard of testing, which is gene knockout tests. Now these pseudogenes are now known to be functional DNA elements and not mistakes, and that is a testable prediction based on our model of created heterozygosity. We can even get into specific genetic markers later. Now, the biggest part of our model, genetic entropy, that is the main focus here on the biblical base model. The biblical base model predicts death, degeneration, and extinction after the fall based on the sin of Adam and Eve. We would predict we are going down and not up. Many changes due to mutation and natural selection would be based on adaptive degeneration, and that's exactly what we see. We observe death, degeneration, and extinction. Think of it this way. We have a genome of 3 billion letters. If you take out 1 letter or change 1 letter randomly, are you going to have a huge fitness effect? It'll have a tiny fitness effect, obviously. And in fact, it's like rust on a car. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. That's why I say the God of the evolutionists is time. With time, you can do what we can't see observable evidence in time today do. And time is no help to bacteria to biologist evolution. We're going down, not up, clearly based on genetic degeneration. And for numerous reasons,
1 minute
if we
left.
get into, how much longer?
1 minute.
Awesome. For numerous reasons, when we get into our discussion part of the debate, rare beneficial mutations, they're not going to sufficiently compensate for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. And natural selection, on the other hand, it's constrained by selection interference. And this is consistent with a biblical-based model that records a time when people had extremely long lives. So we're going to have to talk about natural selection. We're going to have to talk about beneficial mutations, and if they can counterbalance the influx of deleterious mutations, because we know beneficial mutations are rare, and there's a continuous supply of low impact deleterious mutations coming into the population. So in light of the evidence, the bottom line, We agree that natural selection happens, mutation happens, but they lack creative power and we're going down, not up. We are degenerating. All the evidence, genetic-wise, confirms a biblical-based model. It's a double whammy. It confirms a biblical-based model and it refutes a model of evolutionary theory. Thanks so much, James. I'm good to go.
Thanks so much to you, Standing for Truth. We appreciate it. And then we will switch back over into our normal format. So now we will give an introductory statement, or I should say hear an introductory statement from Tom Jump. So thanks for that, Standing for Truth. And Tom Jump, excited to hear yours as well. I will start the clock on your first word.
All right, thanks. So when talking about evolution versus creation, the first thing you need to realize is that debate is not how scientists resolve issues in science. Scientists don't care about debate at all because words are not scientific evidence. Nothing my opponent has to say is evidence. It's not evidence against evolution. It's not evidence for creation. It's just stuff in his head. Science is built on things, empirical evidence of things occurring in the world, not conceptual evidence of things occurring in our head. Theology, politics, and philosophy are resolved by debate because they are concerned with stuff in our head. So what is empirical evidence and why do we need it? If we see a cup fall over, well, what could have caused this to happen? Maybe the wind knocked it over. Maybe somebody bumped the table it was on. Maybe it was a mouse or a squirrel or a bird. Maybe someone used psychic powers or magic or God or a ghost, invisible leprechauns, aliens, asteroids. Maybe the entire world was created 5 minutes ago with the cup already laying on its side and the memories of seeing it fall were illusory. There are infinitely many ways to explain how the cup fell over, all of which except one are imaginary. Therefore, we need some way to filter out the imaginary explanations and leave us with what is reasonable to believe caused the event to happen. Now, all of the infinitely many explanations can explain all past and present data using post hoc or ad hoc reasoning. For example, if we see mouse droppings around the cup, the fallen cup, I can explain that by saying a mouse knocked over the cup and left the droppings. Or I could say a mouse left the droppings and didn't knock over the cup. And I could just pick any of the other infinitely many ways to explain how the cup fell over. All of the infinitely many things can all explain both the cups falling over and the mouse droppings. But if there were no mouse droppings, I could say a mouse did knock over the cup and did leave the droppings, but they were blown away by the wind. Or I could say the mouse just didn't eat that day, so it knocked over the cup, but didn't leave any droppings. All of the infinitely ways can likewise explain the cup falling over and no mouse droppings. All of the infinitely many explanations can explain all past and present data using post or ad hoc reasoning. So no analysis of past or present data is evidence because it can be explained by literally any of the explanations. Therefore, in order to filter out the imaginary explanations, we don't analyze the past and present, we look to the future, namely future testable predictions, novel future testable predictions. If your explanation can make predictions about the future, which we do not already know, and they are confirmed, then we have reason to believe that your explanation is not one of the imaginary ones. This doesn't just apply to fallen cups, but to literally everything. There are infinitely many ways to explain everything. This is known as the problem of underdetermination in science. For example, the topic tonight, the diversity of species and evolution, which can be explained in infinitely many ways as well. It could be explained by evolution or creation, or it could be a combination of both, or quantum fluctuations, or unguided supernatural forces we don't know about, or other undiscovered realms of reality like supernatural or ubernatural, or drunk aliens accidentally creating life by pressing the wrong button on their space probes. Again, there are just infinitely many ways to explain everything. And so we have to look to the future data for evidence. The only thing that qualifies as evidence is future predictions, novel future predictions. Evolution has been used by independent groups and people all across the world and throughout time to make numerous future predictions that were later discovered to be correct. For example, Robert Broom predicted Annamites with double-hinged jaw joints, a transition between reptiles and mammals, discovered in Probagnathus. Richard Alexander, after studying evolution of eusocial insects such as termites, predicted that the same burrowing rodents would have similar processes, which was discovered in mole rats. William Braid predicted birds with asymmetrical flight feathers on front and back legs, which was discovered in Microraptor. Feather morphotype was predicted due to embryological data, which is found in dinosaurs such as Euthrosaurus. It was predicted that if ants evolved to wasps, we would find a transitional fossil exactly in a specific layer that correlates to the Cretaceous period, which was found in a name I can't pronounce. Neil Shubin predicted that a fish-like tetrapod would be in the Ventrostrata of Canada, which was discovered in Tiktaalik, et cetera, et cetera. There are literally hundreds of thousands of such predictions made and confirmed by evolution every year, demonstrated in the hundreds of thousands of papers published in academic journals, which are done by looking at the evolution model, assuming if this is correct, what will we see, predicting a consequence, looking for the consequence and discovering, yep, that's right. Because of these confirmed future testable predictions, criticizing evolution by looking at past or present data is irrelevant. It will never refute evolution. In order to overthrow evolution, you need a theory that can be used by peers in the field to make better future predictions than evolution does. This is the only way to overthrow evolution. The testable predictions made by evolution have been correct so often and so reliably that evolution has more evidence than any other theory in science. It's pretty much the same as heliocentrism, the theory that the Earth revolves around the sun. That is the level of support evolution has. So you have a pretty huge hurdle to try and find testable predictions or a theory that can surpass that. The future testable predictions made by evolution prove it is not one of the imaginary explanations. As far as I know, there are no novel future predictions made by creationism. Post hoc and ad hoc explanations of what we are to see is not a future testable prediction. So we have no reason to believe creationism is not just one of the imaginary post hoc explanations, no more supported than the drunk alien probe hypothesis. It's true that creationism can post hoc and ad hoc explain all of the discovered data and facts and fit it nicely into their model, but literally anyone can do that for any of the imaginary explanations, so none of that is evidence. Moreover, all of these facts that creationists are explaining, we only know them because they were discovered due to future predictions made by evolution. As I said in the beginning, science doesn't care about debate. And the reason is because no combination of words my opponents can pontificate is evidence of his position, because no combination of words can demonstrate his position is not just something in his imagination. Whereas the future predictions made by evolution already have demonstrated it's not imaginary.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Tom. So with that, Tom ends up just a bit early, but that's of course up to the autonomy of the debaters. So we will now move into the open discussion section. And so thanks for that opening, Tom. 40 minutes is how long we will go in open dialogue. So if this excites you guys like it excites me, and you'll be in Pleasure Town in just a second. Okay, so setting the timer for 40 minutes, and here we go.
Awesome. I mean, I can start off here. I noticed that in his opening there, and I appreciate your opening there. Tom, you said science is about empirical evidence, and empirical evidence can only be done on things obviously we can observe, right? Things we can test, demonstrate, investigate, and retest, of course. So not things we can observe like, say, macroevolution. That's why evolution, that type of bacteriobiologist evolution, I would say, is far from empirical science. But I think it would be a good way to start this portion of the discussion by asking you, because I gave my definition of biological evolution, right? A change in allele frequency or a change in gene pool in populations over time or generations. What would your definition be, just so we're not talking, past each other?
Right, I'm happy to agree with that definition. I would just say that microevolution is what is commonly understood as microevolution is evolution from my standpoint, and it accounts for all of the diversity of life. But I just want to object to what you said earlier. Empirical evidence is just future testable predictions. You don't have to observe the thing that you're making the testable prediction about. For example, we make testable predictions about photons. We don't actually see the photons. It's called indirect observation, and it's still empirical. So yes, we can empirically verify evolution in that sense.
Right. So I think if it comes down to two models, two competing explanations, and if we get into, what's testable, what's falsifiable, I'm hoping that is what we'll get into, just to point out the strength of either model. But with your definition of evolution, that type of micro evolutionary variation that you agreed on, where you get the change in the frequency of the expression of different traits. Obviously, I think we can both agree that's not really disputed by either creationists or evolutionists, because that type of evolution would explain the survival of the fittest. So not the actual arrival of the fittest, just a small scale variation, not the major innovations. Like, do you believe that, say, mutations, natural selection, these mechanisms, that they possess the type of creative powers to take, your fish to fishermen?
Yes, but again, I want to object to something you said a little bit earlier. This is not just a competition between two models. Because of the problem of underdetermination, there are infinitely many ways to explain anything. So this is a competition to show that yours isn't imaginary. It has nothing to do with, even if all of mine is completely false, that is not in any way evidence of yours. Right.
I think it would come down to What's the most consistent in light of the data, say? Like, because
Oh,
neo-Darwinism...
no. Apologize to interrupt. It's not all of the past and present data is irrelevant. So there's no consistency is irrelevant. You have to make future testable predictions of things we don't know yet. That's the only thing that qualifies as evidence. So consistency is irrelevant.
Correct. And if we're making testable and falsifiable predictions on things we don't exactly have an answer for yet, like let's say, well, obviously we agree on the definition of evolution, for example. Now, if I look to, my hypothesis of created heterozygosity, where God encoded these functional DNA differences into Adam and Eve, we would look to, the coding and non-coding regions of our genome. And I should ask you, do you believe that the majority of our genome is junk? Or do you believe that the majority of the genome would, say, prove to be functional to some extent?
I believe you're conflating two definitions there. In biology, junk DNA is vague and can mean multiple things. The majority of the genome is non-coding for specific kinds of proteins. It can still do other things, still has other functions. So since the beginning of the junk DNA hypothesis, all biologists already said it was going to have a function. They just said it was going to be a non-coding function. So all the scientists already predicted that most of the DNA was going to be functional in some sense. It's just not going to be coding functional.
Well, the thing is, even if you look at, say, someone like Richard Dawkins, he did state, and he's not the only one, he stated that it's a remarkable fact that the greater part of our genome might as well not be there for all the difference it makes. So I think you're incorrect to say that evolutionary biologists, scientists have always assumed that, because there was a surprise based on the ENCODE research that found that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was transcribed into RNA, suggesting function. So the fact that...
Well, I apologize just to interrupt there. So the ENCODE project was fundamentally flawed. As stated by P.Z. Myers, the ENCODE project just looked for attachments and interactions with proteins. So it's like if you, to use P.Z. Myers' exact example, if you shut off the lights and you go around touching all of the walls until you find your way out, then every time you touch the wall, that was counted as an active part of the genetic code in the ENCODE project. So it was false. Or at least the way you're portraying the conclusion is false. It does not show that all of that was active in the coding process.
No, I would agree that ENCODE defined function as specific biochemical activity. So I mean, you or P.Z. Myers are not obviously incorrect about that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know the function of a given sequence of say this non-coding DNA, but just that there's some activity associated with it. So it at least demonstrates that these areas are not idle, right? And comprehensive...
No, again, I'm going to have to disagree with you on that, because there's a consensus in the biological field that the ENCODE project did not do anything that you're saying it does.
Well, would you disagree with...
Just interactions. There's no actual coding function to these things. ENCODE did not demonstrate any coding function to these things. The consensus is still that the majority of the DNA is still non-coding, just like biologists always suspected it would be.
Well, how come people like Dr. Francis Collins, the leading DNA expert, actually embrace ENCODE and embrace the fact that the majority of our genome is not idle? It is doing something, but based on the gold standard of functional testing, comprehensive knockout experiments. Obviously, we don't know exactly what each sequence does, but through further testing, because it's a foreign language that we're dealing with here. And do you agree that these non-coding areas of DNA, that they're involved in, regulatory functions? For the audience sake, that just means when and how fast to make specific proteins, embryonic development, for example, timings of protein.
Well, they're involved in lots of things. They're just non-coding. So again, when biologists said that there was junk DNA, they did not mean it did nothing. That was never what junk DNA meant. It was always non-coding. So it always had function. They always knew it had some interactions which caused effects in different areas of the body. They never said it did nothing. That was never one of the contentions. There's a lot of people who misrepresent this idea of non-coding as it does nothing. That's just not what it means. Now, I'm not sure what Francis Collins' position is, but I know you can cherry pick a lot of scientists in a lot of hierarchies and say, well, this person believes this strange thing. The science doesn't work based off of anecdotes of particular biologists. It's based on consensus. And the consensus is that the ENCODE project does not in any way refute the non-coding DNA hypothesis.
Well, what they're showing is that the genome, the fact that 80% of the non-coding DNA is at least transcribed in RNA that suggests function, but we're looking to future tests, right? Knockout experiments, for example. But how much of the genome would you say is functional, in a percentage-wise? What would you say?
No idea. I haven't studied it. I just go with whatever the authorities say on the matter.
Because what I find funny is, what has been revealed based on the accumulating papers suggesting, a variety of functions. When it comes to the developmental process, we're just beginning to understand that on a molecular level, right? How coding and non-coding DNA coordinate when, where, and how structures are sequentially put in place to produce that fully functional organism, right? So when you consider those things, with the fact that we understand very little of the DNA language based on the gold standard of functional testing, isn't it a good conclusion that the majority of our genome is functional to some extent based on these facts? Go ahead.
No, I don't know how anything you said leads to the conclusion that the majority of it would be functional.
Well, do you know how much on a mammal, how many experiments, because the gold standard of gene functional testing is gene knockout test, right? Knock out that gene, see what the outcome is. Do you know how much percentage has been done on a mammal?
Not sure.
Well, very little. So it would be premature to make the claim that the majority of non-code. I understand that you agree that it's certainly active to some extent, but we would
right. Non-coding does not mean non-functional. They're not saying that. They're saying we know that DNA does this certain kind of coding function. We know of this function, and we can show that the majority of the genome doesn't do this function that we know about. That's all they're saying. They're not saying it does nothing. They're just saying it doesn't do this one function we know about. We can test it for this one function.
But the thing is, a lot of these non-coding DNA regions, say pseudogenes, for example, genetic markers, they'll use those and say that those are, genomic fossils, evolutionary leftovers to build their nested hierarchies, to build their phylogenetic trees. But they didn't predict that those genes are now necessary and required to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. Because why would a genomic fossil, like a pseudogene, for example, be active to that extent? Because that's a pretty significant role. And even in the cases where there are real broken genes, that they're actually discovered, they're often associated with heritable diseases. So are you saying that they predicted that genetic markers like the beta globin pseudogene, the supposed broken remnant of an ancient chicken gene, are you saying that they predicted that those would have important functions?
Again, the only claim they're saying is that it's non-coding. It doesn't do this one thing of coding these proteins in the way that we know it. That's all they're saying. They have no say over what it does in any other thing. So it can do lots of other things. It could do infinitely many other things. We have no idea. The only claim of the non-coding statement is that it doesn't do this one thing that we know that we can measure. That's it. That's all it says.
Well, from what I know of ENCODE, most cell types, they weren't actually tested. They only tested less than 500 cell types, and there's thousands of cell types. Right?
So I'm not talking about
functions are expected from these thousands of other cell types, and that's what we're predicting based on created heterozygosity. Because if he encoded these pre-existing functional DNA differences, we would expect there to be genome-wide functionality, and not just activity, not the fact that it's just idle, but kind of like what we're seeing in these specific pseudogenes, beta globin pseudogene, for example, that they're actually necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. Just like ERVs, endogenous retroviruses, very, very important in placental development, the embryo. So everything seems to be at least consistent with that hypothesis. I mean, just to put a number on it, how much of the genome do you think is functional percentage-wise? Like, you don't really have an answer for that?
I have no idea. I'm not a biologist. It doesn't even interest me. So again, you can make any statement or fact. You can post hoc or ad hoc reason all past or present data. So none of that is evidence of creationism. None of it. You've got to go make future testable predictions.
Well, I just made a future testable predictions based on the fact that these DNA differences will be functional. so these DNA differences that got encoded into the created kinds, into Adam and Eve, we would predict that they are functional, not just some type of activity, but important functionality.
Sorry, could you
not just evolutionary leftover.
I'm sorry, I'm not following. Could you tell me as briefly as possible, what is the testable prediction?
The testable prediction would be based on more functional testing, say gene knockout tests, because that's the gold standard of science, more very, very important roles, as we're now discovering in these specific pseudogenes, will be discovered.
Okay, evolution has already predicted that there's going to be functions, so that's not a novel testable prediction. No one in evolution said there's not going to have any functions to it, so that's already known. That was already known before.
I wouldn't agree that evolutionists. I mean, we can agree to disagree on that. We'll probably need some actual specific data for that. But if you agree that
actually, I'll give you a reference. The Wikipedia for junk DNA specifically just says that. So it goes through and says no one says these are going to be non-functional. They have functions. That's totally fine. It's just a misrepresentation of what non-coding means. So could you give me a different example of a future testable prediction that you can make based off of?
Well, what I'm saying is that evolutionists build their phylogenetic systematic charts based on a primary assumption that most of our genome is evolutionary leftovers, genomic fossils from past common ancestors through the evolutionary process. So I would
totally
say,
agree with all of that. Totally agree with all of that. That doesn't mean it doesn't do anything. That's not what they're saying at all.
Yeah.
So can you give me a future prediction that creationism can make?
Well, I disagree with the fact that evolutionists would say that. I would say that they have assumed that those types of functions, regulatory functions, expressive functions, functions in the embryo, I mean, these are not, if these are just broken genes or evolutionary leftovers, they're not supposed to have those types of important roles, especially over millions and millions.
So that's, you're just misrepresenting what non-coding means. That's never what geneticists said non-coding meant. So again, you can just read the Wikipedia on junk DNA or any reference on it. That's just not what it means. But so again, just to go back, can you give me a future testable prediction creationism can make?
Well, before I give you another testable prediction, because we're talking about my side, if there's any validity to your side and you're looking to natural selections, mutations to say, build the genome based on what we know about accumulating low impact deleterious mutations, which we would predict based on the fall, based on the biblical story of Adam and Eve, death, degeneration, extinction, how are you going to take your fish to fishermen by losing information, right? Due to the rare influx or due to the massive influx of deleterious mutations, and the fact that, like, do you believe beneficial mutations that are truly non-deleterious in any way are rare or common?
Yes, they're definitely rare. They're extremely rare, but it only takes one, and then that one will be spread to the entire species within a very short period of time.
Right.
But again, that's just post hoc ad hoc reasoning. So none of that even matters. If I just granted that, evolution still makes future testable predictions. Evolution is still right.
Well, no, because you're saying that these beneficial mutations, the rare ones, that they're going to be able to be the type of compensation that's needed to stop the net loss of information, because it all comes down to net loss versus net gain. And even natural selection itself, you know, these low impact deleterious mutations at near neutral nucleotide sites, which contain meaningful information, they're non-selectable. They're unselectable. So they're not noticed by natural selection. Natural selection acts on the phenotype, not the genotype. So at the end of the day, if we're degenerating, if we're going down, not up, consistent with a literal interpretation of Genesis, evolution is falsified. So regardless of my testable predictions, whether or not you agree with
that's immediately wrong. That's immediately wrong. If I said there is a square circle, and that square circle can be used to make testable predictions, square circles exist. So nothing you can do about the past evidence, even if you were right, that would not refute evolution because it successfully makes future predictions.
See, the thing is, you're misrepresenting the joke, because no evolutionist predicted large-scale function the way we see. Many scientists in the past actually ignored those regions for years because they were so sure most of the DNA language is non-functional. So that testable.
No, again, I apologize to interrupt, but again, you're just misrepresenting what they meant by non-functional. But again, even if I grant everything you said, I could just suppose, like, I have a theory of a round square, something that is logically contradictory. If it can make testable predictions that work, it exists. So none of the contradictions that you can outline, even if I grant all of them, are in any way evidence against evolution. The only way to overthrow evolution is you need to make more, better future predictions than evolution does. And you've presented none so far. One, I think.
No, I would agree that I have presented some, but your beneficial mutation that you talk about that's going to drift into the population, lead to that type of large-scale evolution, the best beneficial mutations you could provide are always reductive. For example, sickle cell anemia has a significant impact, but it's a broken gene, broken protein in the long run. It's not taking things forward. So
let me talk about
that type of evolution. How are we going to take things forward? Go ahead.
All right, so if you have a sequence like AAAB, 3 A's and a B, if you remove the B, you get AAA. If you have a sequence of AA, just 2 A's, and you add an A, you get AAA. If suppose AAA is the positive beneficial mutation, you can get it from adding an A to AA or removing a B from AAAB. So whether or not it's a reduction in the gene in some way or an addition, you still get the same beneficial mutation. So that's irrelevant. Your point doesn't even lead to the conclusion that you're trying to argue, because we can get beneficial mutations from reductions or additions. Makes no difference.
No, the problem with that is that, well, for one, you agreed that these beneficial mutations are rare, so that's good. But the non-neutral mutations are consistently deleterious, as anybody should expect with typographical errors and attacks. Just like the example you said, that slow degradation, that slow accumulation of deleterious mistakes, as expected with a typographical error in a text, that's only going to lead to further degradation. And we can predict that, and we can actually look at specific examples. For example, mammoth populations, we know, carried a large genetic load. They were very susceptible to this reductive evolution, led to the extinction of them. Homo Neanderthal, 40% less fit than modern humans. So this increased genetic load leads to extinction. It doesn't lead to that type of evolution that you want to believe in. So future predictions, the more we sequence certain species and based on accumulation of deleterious mutations, we're going to see more extinction events as compared to that type of large-scale evolution that obviously, you're trying to convince us of today. Are you familiar with?
Well, we can prove all of that wrong and just test with bacteria. If you were right and they were just deleterious and causing increased genetic load, then in a lab with enough, like 50 million generations of bacteria, we could just see them all die off. So you're wrong immediately, because we can show that they actually do get better and gain more information and more survivability in the lab with bacteria. We have a very.
Right. So I'm glad. I'm glad that. But
again, still, you're just evading my point here. Nothing you say about past or present data can ever be evidence for creation. It can't work. We have future testable predictions of evolution. Even if it was logically contradictory, even if I granted everything you said, nothing you have said is evidence. Nothing. It's not against evolution.
I would disagree, because even your example of bacteria, you can Google bacterial reductive evolution. It's very common.
Again, I apologize. Apologize for interrupting, but none of that matters.
Oh, no, it does matter, because
again, scientists don't care. None of your opinions don't matter to scientists. You have to provide testable predictions.
Well, the thing is, evolution has already been falsified based on the fact that we're accumulating these near-neutral deleterious mutations. And if the best thing you're going to provide to me is some type of beneficial, some degenerative beneficial adaptation, even if you look at gene duplications, which are universally deleterious, how are these beneficial mutations going to counterbalance and offset the accumulating deleterious mutations, let alone all the other accumulating mutations? So for every example you can give me is some type of degenerative adaptation, that's more consistent with our. I know you don't want to go into consistency, but if your model's falsified and our model's the only one that's consistent with reality, I mean, if natural selection can't act upon these,
you keep missing my point. You've not addressed any of my points yet. Everything you've said is post hoc, ad hoc reasoning, irrelevant. Scientists have solved this. Scientists know all the answers to this. Everything you're saying is just stuff in your head. Imagined.
They don't have the answers to it, actually.
That don't matter. Prove to me any of this stuff you're saying corresponds to reality. Give me a future testable prediction.
I've already given you future testable predictions based on further gene sequencing of certain populations, certain animals. Even Lenski himself with the bacteria is slowly demonstrating genetic degeneration, because the adaptation that was seen was largely accomplished by means of loss of function.
What is the prediction? What's the prediction?
Our prediction is based on further gene sequencing of certain populations that may not have been sequenced. We're going to see I don't know what you mean. I don't know what you mean when you say that. A
prediction is if X, then Y. So I can say if the sun exists, it will rise tomorrow. What is your prediction?
if there's a net loss of information being seen in these changes in these populations, that is more consistent with a biblical-based model of death, degeneration, and decay. And it's a double whammy. It disproves pond scum to people evolution, and it demonstrates biblical creation. There's a pandemic, entropic degeneration on all levels. Here's another prediction: Alzheimer's disease, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune, cancers, immunological diseases. These are going to skyrocket in the future. 50 times more cancer in the future than what we see now, because we already see increased rates of these types of things. Autism's on the rise, for example. Entropic degeneration on all levels based on accumulation of near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations. What more do you need? There's your
good. That's a great testable prediction. I totally agree. If you're right and that the amount of Alzheimer's and cancer skyrocket, that would be a verified prediction, and that would be evidence for your conclusion. Now prove it or go away.
Well, the thing is,
since we can't test that, you got to give me something we can test. That's not a testable one.
We can test it because there's already a pandemic, entropic degeneration on all levels. And every time we've sequenced, look at the Neanderthals, we sequenced their genes, and what did we see? They had a high genetic load, they were highly inbred. Look at the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, highly inbred. They suffered from reductive evolution, which resulted in their reduced body size, reduced brain volume, and various other pathologies. So everything we're seeing, this type of increased genetic load, this type of reductive evolution, bacteria, viruses.
You're going on for a little, just to interrupt again. So again, all that's explained by evolution, not a problem. You gave me a testable prediction, but not one that we can actually test. So can you give me a testable prediction we can test? In the future prediction things we don't already know that we can test.
What's a prediction you can make based on these beneficial mutations? How many of these beneficial mutations have to be fixated in a population? Are you familiar with Haldane's dilemma? I mean, the amount of time it's going to take
to limit so next.
What's that? That hasn't been solved. You can't just say that these have all been solved. And the thing is, Dr. John Sanders...
I can say, I apologize. I'm not saying they're solved. I'm saying no one in biology cares because they don't see it as anything more than imaginary. You haven't shown any of these things correspond to reality. They're all just imaginary things people have thought up. Like I can make up a Bobbledy-Boop dilemma. Okay, solve the Bobbledy-Boop dilemma with creationism. Like, you probably wouldn't care because it's just something I made up. So you actually have to show these things aren't made up. The first thing you have to do is you have to show that they correspond to reality and are not just imaginary. And to do that, what you need is future testable novel predictions. And so far the ones you've given me are you definitely gave me a future prediction, but not a testable one. I don't remember what the first one was, but I still haven't seen any that are future testable.
Let me go ahead. So based on what we know on these bacterial populations, mammoth populations, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, Homo neanderthalis, based on the entropic degeneration on all levels in regards to mutation-related diseases, we can look at viruses. And they made a prediction that the H1N1 human virus actually went extinct due to a linear accumulation of deleterious mutations. So we know that it went from a red hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event in 90 years. And they actually observed this through studies. There's a very, very rock solid paper on it. And evolutionists might say, oh, you know, it went extinct through adaptive evolution, but adaptive evolution doesn't cause extinction events. So, I mean, there's a testable prediction that was actually confirmed.
Right, and evolutionists are the ones who made it because evolution doesn't reject the idea that there is gene degradation. Of course, there's gene degradation. I mean, they said that there's a prediction about
that prediction now.
It's just an assumption, but no, I would say that evolution doesn't reject the idea of gene degradation. Of course, genes degrade. There is a computational analysis of the minimum number of humans that could possibly exist, because if there were any less, the gene degradation would be more than the new information being produced, and all humans would go extinct if the population dropped below 1,200 people. So yes, evolution grants that there is gene degradation, but it also says that there's enough new information through evolution to accommodate that. So
no, that's not a... No, I want to address that because the whole genome is degenerating, so you've admitted that, but it's throwing out so much information. So while trying to make up for it with a few beneficial mutations, as you've talked about, you've kind of hinted at the fact that maybe there's a trade-off. That's not actually going to solve the problem because compensating for loss of information is not actually possible. So
again, that's just stuff in your head. I don't agree with any of that.
Exactly
just stuff in your head. Again, all that stuff in your head. You got to show me it's something in reality. Give me a novel, testable future prediction, or otherwise, that's just stuff in your head.
Well, the thing is, I've already got papers in scientific papers that actually back all this stuff. Even if the genome, for example, as we were talking about with the non-coding DNA, even if it's shown to be at least 10% functional, there's a paper that came out recently that human evolution would actually be impossible. And
again, apologize for interrupting. most biologists, the entire field of biology, and everyone in the academic field the consensus is evolution happens. So no matter what you give me, I can just say the academic consensus says you're wrong. I have more evidence.
Yeah, but it's not going to look good that you don't have any explanation for the influx of deleterious low impact mutations that natural selection can't act upon. So at least according to this,
that's all in your head. That's all in your head.
I've already given you a ton of examples on. So we made
evidence. You got to give me testable future predictions. Testable future predictions.
Okay, so a testable prediction would be based on the LMN haplogroups and the length of the lines that you actually look at when you sequence these mitochondrial DNA variants across the women. The length of the lines are actually long and the lengths connecting them are short. So that would be a testable prediction in regards to post-flood humanity based on the fact that Noah's 3 daughters-in-law, because that would be consistent with LMN, 3 major haplogroups. So we made a prediction. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen chose on that phylogenetic tree the base of the L as one of the wives of Noah's sons, with the bases of M and N as the wives of the other 2 sons. So the predictions that actually flow from that are mutation rates in certain peoples that haven't actually been measured. For example, the Khoisan people. So evolutionists haven't actually measured those rates. So this prediction would involve us measuring those rates and seeing what his prediction is, and if that came true. Because
awesome, that's a great example. Now do the test and show it.
Okay, so
because if you don't do the test and show it, then you have no evidence. Because right now it's just something in your head. Now you have to do the test and show it.
Okay, so there's your testable, falsifiable prediction. But how do you feel that all this?
No, I apologize again. It's not just testable, falsifiable. You have to actually verify it. You have to verify it before it counts as evidence.
Now, how come evolutionists aren't actually making testable predictions on this mitochondrial DNA tree where you can sequence all these women? Because we know mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through women. So if there's all these independent lines of evidence fitting exactly what we'd expect, given a literal interpretation of Genesis, how come you're not convinced by it? Like, what's it going to take to convince you? We see death, degeneration, and decay of the genome. We see low genetic diversity between human beings, which is consistent with, coming from 2 people, Adam and Eve, 3 major haplogroups. I mean, what do you need to see? Like, is there anything that can convince you?
Yes, you need more novel testable predictions in your theory than is produced by evolution. That is the evidence. Right now, you've given me like 2. Evolution has like 2 million. Because every year there's about 100,000 papers published in biology alone, in academic papers, making future testable predictions that were verified through experiment. So right now you've got essentially nothing on evolution. And everything you just gave was stuff we already knew that you're just explaining post hoc. So most of those things aren't evidence.
This amount
of... give me... What?
No, they didn't predict this amount of degeneration, because we pass on 100 to 300 new mutations from our reproductive cells onto the next generation. So our children and their children's children and their children's children's children.
Say that again. Say that again. How many? You said what?
Approximately 100 new mutations per person per generation. So that's, if you do the calculation, 700 billion new mutations entering this generation alone. So how is natural selection going to rid these populations of such extensive amounts of deleterious mutations? I mean, I'm kind of curious.
Because they're not all deleterious. They're not all deleterious. Most of them are neutral, and some of them are positive.
The thing is, even the near neutral mutations, kind of like a book the size of an encyclopedia, one single spelling mistake in there is not going to be. It will be neutral to the phenotype, to the outward appearance, but it's kind of like rust on a car. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. So sure, you can.
That's just something in your head, as far as I know. I don't see any testable predictions to verify anything you just said.
Well, I've shown you all these extinct populations based on this accumulating genetic
right, and evolution predicts that there is a certain population limit, and that if you go below that population limit, the degradation will outweigh the positive things, and they will go extinct. So evolution already knew that. You're not showing us anything new.
Well, how do you explain the increased rates of Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune diseases, cancers, immunological? I mean, it seems like this type of pawns come to people evolution. It only occurs in the imagination of the evolutionist who wants to believe.
Well, none of that's a problem with evolution. None of that's a problem with evolution. So I don't know why would you even bring those up? I don't understand.
Well, because things aren't being taken forward. I mean, all known examples, whether it's nylon digestion by bacteria, aerobic citrate digestion, African resistance to malaria, it's all due to broken genes, broken cells, broken proteins, loss of information. I mean, you're not going to take your fish.
Well, actually, no, cancer is actually due to an addition. It's like 10,000 changes. I think in a cell, 5 to 10,000 changes in a cell is what produces a cancer cell.
Well, if you could just take time to answer the question of how natural selection, because obviously natural selection will amplify the best beneficial mutations, let's say antibiotic resistance, for example, and it's going to get rid of the most detrimental mutations, but it can't do anything against the low impact near neutral deleterious mutations. Those are the ones that accumulate and slowly degenerate our information system. So like, what does the evolutionary literature say in regards to that, and how can natural selection and beneficial mutations overcome the accumulating damage? I'm just curious if the issue is net gain versus net loss, and we see a net loss, and those mutations are unselectable. I mean, how do you explain that? Go ahead, take your time.
Because with bigger changes, there's lots of net gain. With one positive mutation that's beneficial, there's a whole lot of gain. It's not just a little gain; it's a lot of gain.
Right. So that would be like an appeal to super beneficial mutations. But the thing is,
here's one example: an entire genome duplication. You can have an entire genome be duplicated in a cell. I mean, there's a big gain right there.
Right. But when you look at gene duplications, for one, they're universally deleterious. So even if I just for sake of argument, Tom, I just said, you know what,
that's just made up in your head.
Even if I just say, okay, here, take a few rare beneficial duplications, that's still not going to be able to offset the many accumulating deleterious mutations, and I mean duplications, let alone all the other accumulating mutations, point mutations, whatever it is. So
I want to try to focus on this point. I want to try to explain this to you. Like in my introduction, I said you can always explain anything from any explanation. It's never impossible. I can say there are magical leprechauns that help evolution, and then poof, all problems solved. There's nothing you cannot explain with an explanation from the past or present data. There's nothing about that that's a problem for nothing.
Well, how come the evolution? Okay. I like what you're saying there. So, I like what you're saying. So, how come evolutionists have to resort to a bottleneck based on the low genetic diversity that we see among humans? So how come you have to, or for example, why is the Y chromosome so different in chimps than in human beings? I mean, what's the rest? Because it seems like it's just rescue device upon rescue device. So low genetic diversity.
Right. Just stick with that for a second. You're right. Every single explanation can use post hoc or ad hoc reasoning to explain everything. The question is are the evolution explanations the post hoc and ad hoc reasoning, or are yours the post hoc and ad hoc reasoning? And the way we tell the difference is which one can make future testable predictions. Evolution does is make hundreds of thousands of them. Yours has made none.
Okay, so
evolution is right.
But I just want to clarify one thing. So the mutation rate predictions that we made on the Khoisan peoples and thousands of other species, because so far the species that we've actually sequenced, the several of them, they're constant and they're staying the same. So Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has actually made significant predictions not only on mitochondrial DNA and, for example, certain African groups like the Khoisan peoples, but also on thousands of other species. So once we sequence those, if they're consistent with the species that have already been measured, there's another testable and falsifiable prediction. The evolutionists can go and test these species for themselves and see if the prediction is true, not only on the Khoisan peoples, but also on the, right? So is that another prediction?
Yes, those are great predictions, but none of them are evidence until you actually verify them. You have to verify them first before they count as evidence. Like I can predict that there's going to be a teapot in between Mars and Earth, but that isn't very good until you actually confirm it.
So it just seems like, so low genetic diversity, one whale, or the one Y male ancestor, one Y chromosome, obviously one mitochondrial DNA ancestor.
I apologize to interrupt again. You keep going back.
It seems like nothing to convince you.
No, you haven't presented any evidence. You keep going back to past and present data and saying, I can ad hoc explain this from my theory. Everyone can do that. None of that is a problem. The only thing that counts as evidence, as I said in my introduction, is future novel testable predictions that you have to verify. All the past and present stuff is irrelevant. None of it matters. None of it is evidence. Evolution makes testable future predictions. You don't. That have been verified.
Well, okay, so we do make testable predictions. But the thing is, you're saying that everything can be explained through ad hoc, post hoc explanations, but if you actually look at the literature behind the accumulation of near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations, all the evolutionists speak of is the obvious. Beneficials happen, selection happens, adaptation happens, but anybody with a basic understanding of genetics, and you seem to know your stuff, which is good, understands and knows these things. So those arguments against genetic entropy only begin after acknowledging those obvious things. So if there's no actual ad hoc, post hoc, rescue device explanation for
you said you said if there is no ad hoc post hoc. That's impossible. That is logically impossible. There are always ad hoc post hoc reasons for literally everything. Magical leprechauns is one possible example. There are infinitely many. There can never be no way to explain it. There are always ways to explain it. That's why none of that is evidence.
So
you have to give future prediction.
Right. I've given you a testable prediction, but the biblical flood
that are verified.
Yeah, I want to give you a verified one. The biblical flood model that I'm talking about, where evolutionists have to resort to a flood bottleneck, we actually predicted that first. It's fulfilled by us, but evolutionists had to copy that from the creation.
What do you mean by flood bottleneck? What are you talking about? You lost me.
Well, the low genetic because the evolutionists will say, to explain the low genetic diversity that we see, I think it's only 0.5% different between all human beings. So evolutionists had to resort to a bottleneck at some point, right? The population was reduced to 10,000 people. One, female ancestor came out of those, whether it was Homo erectus or whatever it is, I can't remember right now. One male ancestor came. I mean, they had to explain all that after we already predicted that based on a literal interpretation of Genesis of 8 people after the flood and 2 people, Adam and Eve, at creation. So this low genetic diversity, 1 Y chromosome, 1 mitochondrial DNA, 3 major haplogroups, most genes come in 2 versions, single dispersion of DNA variants. That was all predicted by the biblical creation model, and the evolutionists had to come up with a rescue device. So isn't that a confirmed prediction?
No, you have to make it before you actually discover the information. You have to make the prediction.
But
that's, I'm pretty sure it's explained by punctuated equilibrium anyway, because the genetic diversity in a species that is within a wider range of trading genetic information usually does not have very much diversity. So we can observe that in lots of species. So punctuated equilibrium seems to be able to solve that problem. But as far as I know, so again, to make a testable future prediction, you have to say, if my model is correct, here is what we would expect to see, which we haven't seen yet, then test it and show that it's true.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure that those were predicted beforehand, and that's why the evolutionists had to resort to the rescue device. Plus, we have future testable predictions that we can now look for based on future genomic testing, based on future measured mitochondrial.
Those are great. I totally agree. Those future predictions you made are perfectly good evidence if you can verify them, but you have to verify them first.
Well, are you familiar with?
Are
you familiar? What's that?
We got 5 seconds. So if you want to ask your question to Tom, and we'll let Tom answer, and then move to the closing.
That went by quick. No, at 5 seconds, I can't really. Actually, I would just say thanks, Tom. That was actually a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Good back and forth.
Definitely interesting. I think the audience has definitely enjoyed it as well, in addition to me. Lively chat. So a lot of questions. I'm very excited for these. So just a reminder, everybody, if you have a question, if this is your first time here, if you just put an @moderndaydebate into the comments and then put, question for Tom or question for Standing for Truth, and then put your question, I'll add it to the Q&A list, and then we'll read it during the Q&A. And then also super chats if you have a super chat, you can also make a comment to one of the debaters that they'll respond to. If you don't want to ask a question, you'd rather comment instead, and also super chats will move them to the front of the list. So thank you very much for that super chat already from Dr. Kent Hoven. It's Kent Hoven CPA. He's Kent Hoven's certified public accountant is just always here. It's not really him, but I honestly it's hard not to laugh when I see this account, especially the picture. But he said, well, we'll get to that once the Q&A starts. I just that way we give Standing for Truth a chance to respond. So we will start with the closing statements. These are just going to be short, 5 minutes or less, from both debaters, starting with Standing for Truth, and I have the clock set Standing for Truth, so when you are ready, I will start the timer.
Awesome. Well, no, I appreciate that, Tom. You know, that was a good back and forth. Just a few things. Don't like to leave things hanging. Wrote a few things down from his opening statement. The alleged succession of mammal-like reptiles towards, you know, the ever more mammalness is not actually found at any one location on Earth. It's only inferred. A lot of this is inferred if you want to appeal to the fossil record, and it's inferred through the correlation of fossiliferous beds from different continents. So judgments and guesses are made. A lot of it is based on circularity. Fossils are fickle. They are fragmentary, sparse, and open to contrasting and contradictory interpretation. And even cladistics, you know, that was developed by evolutionists for evolutionists, and it still fails to demonstrate evolution, let alone biological reality. So at the end of the day, going to fossils, which are just circumstantial evidence requiring an actual theory that actually can explain the observed data, that can actually build the genome. If you're going to go from a single cell to a multi-cell to a fish to an amphibian to a reptile to a bird to a mammal to a monkey to a man, that's going to take incredible increases in novel and meaningful genetic information. And as I presented, I mean, he didn't give any. I gave him some testable falsifiable predictions pre and post. Creationists are doing it. They're making the testable predictions on mutation rates, Khoisan peoples. We're predicting the death, degeneration, and extinction events of, obviously, the genome. We've seen it in mammoth populations. We're seeing it in cheetah populations, butterfly populations, Homo neanderthal, Homo erectus, viruses, bacterial populations. I mean, it's everywhere. If you want to believe it, Dr. John Sanford, he made a very powerful statement. Anybody who is willing and open-minded and will look at the data for what it is, I mean, they can't honestly and intellectually believe in something like pond scum to people evolution. So beneficials, you know, they cannot keep up with the deleterious mutations. Selection interference, as I talked about with him, profoundly limits selection interference. And near neutrals, as I talked about, these low impact near neutral deleterious mutations, they are virtually unstoppable. So the Bible records a time when people had extremely long lives, and when you actually look at the data of accumulating mutations and you look at the data of the lives as talked about in the early chapters of Genesis, they flow perfectly. So the only conclusion would be, you know, the data is real and human life expectancy was once hundreds of years, but has progressively declined to current values. So the most obvious and apparent explanation for such declining lifespans would be genetic degeneration due to mutation accumulation. So at the end of the day, it can't be stopped. Linkage groups, as I was going to talk about, another fact that evolutionists have no explanation for, not even a rescue device, because these linkage groups, they're actually a killer and a destroyer for evolution. This means that every linkage group is degenerate, and these mutations in these linkage groups, they're linked basically forever, James. And so if you have lots of bad mutations in that linkage group, and that linkage group is reducing in fitness continuously based on accumulating deleterious mutations, and you throw in one or two beneficials, as Tom and I talked about, they're just going to get neutralized by the large numbers of deleterious mutations. So the fact is, recombination appears to be primarily between genes rather than between nucleotides. So within any local gene sequences, these linkage groups, there's effectively no combination, and even if there is the rare time, it's not going to offset the accumulating damage. So I'd like to see some type of explanation from Tom on these facts, because both evolutionists and creationists agree that natural selection happens. Natural selection will only remove, and I told this thing to him, I'd like to see an answer, the worst deleterious and detrimental mutations, and will only amplify the very best beneficial mutations. So what does this indicate and suggest? The accumulating damage is largely invisible and unselectable. He's going to have to address the key issue of net loss versus net gain. Every single example of a beneficial mutation, for one, they're finding out a lot of them are just epigenetic, regulated, increased expression of that certain gene, and gene duplications, they're not going to be able to offset the many accumulating deleterious mutations. So at the end of the day, we're going down, not up. And if you looked at the literature on genetic entropy, they've even come up with rescue devices, synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanisms. So all population geneticists recognize this problem, but evolution has to be true to them. So anybody, you know, who's intellectually honest will look at the data How much longer?
15 seconds left.
Anybody who's intellectually honest is going to look at the data, but 2 Peter 3 tells us that in the last days there's going to be scoffers denying the creation, the biblical flood, and the return of Jesus Christ. So some people just don't want to believe. Thanks a lot, James, and thanks a lot, Tom.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Standing for Truth. And now, 5 minutes from our good friend Tom Jump. So we appreciate that. And your questions we appreciate. We have a good list of them. So Tom, I will start the clock on your first word.
So in science, there's this thing called the problem of underdetermination, which means there are infinitely many ways to explain everything. So every time Standing says, well, they don't have an explanation for it, well, he's just immediately wrong. Anybody can make up explanations for all of this. Scientists just don't prefer to make stuff up. They prefer to wait for empirical evidence and make future testable predictions. Now, all of the cases that Standing brought up were all past and present data that can be post hoc explained by anyone using the problem of underdetermination. So none of that's actually evidence. The reason we know evolution is true and creationism is false is because evolution makes future testable predictions. That's the only way you can show something is true. That's the only thing that qualifies as real evidence in science. And that's why science doesn't care about debate. Because there's no combinations of words that Standing can use that can show his theory isn't just something in his head. In science, you have to do experiments in the lab, future testable predictions. Words just don't, no one cares.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much for your closing statement, Tom, as well. So with that, we will move into the Q&A section. So this is where things heat up, and this will be a lot of fun. So first, super chat from, as I mentioned, Dr. Hoven's alleged certified public accountant. Oh, the picture. Where did you get that picture? I honestly just think that's such a funny picture, but okay. He said, all apologists lie. It's a job requirement. So my guess is that would be for you, Standing for Truth. If you want to respond, you can.
What was it? Can you say it again, brother?
That all apologists lie. It's a job requirement.
That was more of a statement. You can move on.
Actually, I'd like to address that. I would disagree, because a lie says that there's some kind of intentional misrepresentation of the facts, where I think Standing actually believes what he says. So I don't think Standing is lying. I think he's wrong, but I don't think he's lying.
Gotcha. And next we have Cragnite Wolf. This is actually, he was so excited to ask this question that he actually emailed it. So before the debate, he said, hundreds of fine-tuned parameters in the universe forced atheists to believe in the anti-science idea of the multiverse. So why do atheists resist evidence throughout history?
I think that question was from Jeremy. Sorry to.
Oh, that is from Jeremy. Sorry about. I jumped the gun on that. This is not emailed in. This was actually came in during the live chat. Sorry about that. Jeremy, forgive me. We'll come right back to yours, Cragnite Wolf. But Jeremy asks, he says, kind of prefaces the question with, hundreds of fine-tuned parameters in the universe forced atheists to believe in the anti-scientific idea of the multiverse. And then he says, why do atheists resist evidence throughout history?
All right, I actually had a conversation with a theist cosmologist last Monday, and we talked about the fine-tuning argument. The multiverse has nothing to do with the fine-tuning argument. The multiverse is a combination of mathematical equations and vacuum energy and early universe inflation. It's not to explain the fine-tuning. It's purely a combination of already known physics. So it has nothing to do with the fine-tuning. The reason physicists believe in the multiverse is because it's a combination of known physics. It's not to explain the fine-tuning. Secondly, the fine-tuning can be explained by necessity, as in all of the laws are interconnected by some more fundamental law we haven't discovered yet, kind of like how we've discovered the weakened electromagnetic force are actually the same force. So we can say that the fine-tuning is just apparent because we haven't discovered the more fundamental thing yet. And it can also be explained by pure chance. Like, for example, not a great argument, one made by Victor Stinger, that the laws could be interconnected, and changing multiple congruent constants could make many different combinations of life-limiting constants. So nothing about the fine-tuning argument indicates a God. It was never evidence of a God, and the reason the multiverse was created has nothing to do with the fine-tuning argument. Gotcha.
Thank you very much. And Cragnite, well, thank you very much for... Oh, no, it's Jeremy. Sorry, Jeremy. Jeremy Ike, 6/1944. Thank you for your question. So next we have Cragnite Wolf, who asks, Is genetic entropy happening across all life forms, animals, insects, and plants, or is it some of them? And can you make any scientific predictions on which life forms will go extinct next due to genetic entropy?
Well, very good question. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing mutation accumulation in all species. It's even being revealed that, you know, there's a high genetic load in certain isolated butterfly populations, and that they're vulnerable to extinction due to this high genetic load, just like the cheetah populations that we're seeing as well. Mammoth populations, as I talked about, they carried an elevated genetic load. Entropic degeneration on all level, as I was explaining to Tom in our back and forth. Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune diseases, cancers, immunological diseases, these are going to be on the rise. That's a pretty obvious prediction based on our model of genetic entropy. We see it in bacteria. I will put it this way: bacteria would be expected to be the most immune to genetic entropy, and the best way I could put it would be with an analogy. Take a bike and take a car. Take a Chevy Camaro. There's a lot more parts. There's a lot more that can go wrong with a Chevy Camaro than can go wrong with a bike. And if something goes wrong with a bike, there's only a few parts. So chances are you're going to notice it and you're going to fix it. That can be akin to natural selection. But in a car, something like a Chevy Camaro, I mean, it's going to degenerate faster because there's more things that can go wrong with it. But even in bacterial populations, you can just Google reductive evolution in bacteria. Even Lenski himself is revealing adaptations, of course, but they're largely accomplished by means of loss of function and loss of regulation mutations. So even these early human populations like hobbits, Neanderthals, they had a high genetic load as well. So to be honest with you, the amount of genetic entropy data, even in viruses, H1N1 human version, I mean, I could probably go on for hours and hours. It's everywhere. But good question. I appreciate it.
Actually, I'd like to follow up on that. If genetic entropy is everywhere, then all single-celled organisms would be dead in 500 years. So it doesn't seem, that seems to like rule out your hypothesis completely.
Gotcha. So we will next go to James Downard, and his question is, for Standing for Truth, please name any working geneticists other than the narrow Sanford, so no T in there, Sanford creationists who accept the notions you are presenting.
Well, all population geneticists recognize that man is presently degenerating. The thing is, they might come up with rescue devices such as mutation count mechanism, synergistic epistasis, because obviously they need to hold to their primary axiom. But at the end of the day, if these near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations are accumulating continuously and they are destructive and they are unselectable, well, at the end of the day, they're only going to slowly degenerate our information systems. And that's exactly what we would expect given a biblical based model and a literal interpretation of Genesis. But you can look at even John Sanford himself, actually Alexei Kondrashov, you can read his papers. Michael Lynch, I think is his name. Obviously they hold to pawns come to people evolution because they're not just going to tap out and say, okay, must not be true. They're going to come up with rescue devices. Just like when they're phylogenetic systematic trees, whenever there's inconsistencies, they'll resort to things like convergent evolution, loss of traits. So at the end of the day, there's always going to be a rescue device. But there's even a paper I would recommend Tom look into, or even you, James, or James Downard. It's the waiting time problem. So it's a rock solid paper. It's been read by 10,000 people with no serious critique, and it just has to do with the fact that even just to get one simple genetic word, say a string of 8, which would be a short genetic word, as I said, you need more time than the universe has had. So that actually falsifies bacteria to biologist type evolution. Hopefully that answers this question, and I appreciate it.
Gotcha.
I doubt that's published in the academic paper, but you didn't really answer his question, because his question was, like, are there any working geneticists who are creationists? Like, you claim that all these guys are having escape devices, but it seems more like to us that you're the one making up the escape devices and their stuff is actually just what's true. So do you know any working geneticists who are creationists, who believe in your creation model?
that are working geneticists that are creationists. Dr. Tompkins, Dr. Sanford, Dr. Robert Carter, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen. I thought he was talking about geneticists that aren't creationists. That would make more sense. Talking about all population geneticists, Alexei Kondrashov, Michael Lynch, Komora, these guys recognize that man is presently degenerating. That's why they come up with these numerical simulations to demonstrate, you know, why or how natural selection might be able to rid the population of these near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations, but they've been unsuccessful. And people like Dr. John Sanford, Dr. Robert Carter, they've come out with secular. You can even look at NIH. He just spoke at NIH, and that's National Institute for Health. I mean, they're not a creationist organization, and they're recognizing that there is a pandemic. And the thing is, if you don't recognize this pandemic, how are we going to deal with these issues like cancers, immunological related diseases, autoimmune diseases? We need to recognize that man is degenerating, and we need to figure out a way to, because the thing is, mutations are harmful. Mutations hurt people, and that's why I always say our hope is in Christ. I mean, it is the eventual degeneration of our species is inevitable, but our hope is in Christ, and really that's all I have to say to that.
Gotcha. Next we have Karad Nightwolf asks, what is standing for truth's best evidence for easy bake oven created kinds and for dirt to man, rib to woman creation?
He's asking what the best evidence for created kinds are?
That's he said, what is your best evidence for quote unquote easy bake oven created kinds and for dirt to man, rib to woman creation?
Well, we could look at the fact that, you know, Eve came from Adam. We would expect there to be, you know, mostly two gene variants, and that's exactly what we see. And created kinds, where, you know, phenomenal work is being done on created kinds because it all depends on what type of testable predictions can flow from your choice. So, for example, say we choose family level as you know, the created kind is in what's not ancestry shared and what is. I mean, we can look at orphan genes, which are taxonomically restricted, no evidence of any ancestry. And the more we study the DNA language, we're looking to functionally, this would be our prediction, functionally unique DNA differences across families, functionally similar or neutral DNA differences within families. Because obviously, you know, if we say domestic dogs, wolves, coyotes are all related through common ancestry, well, we would expect that, but because they're related. So that's where we're looking at inbreeding as well, obviously, because they'll bring forth after their kind, so it has to do with bringing forth. But it's in genetics where the battle's won, and it's in genetics where we identify what is and what isn't related. That would be identifying the created kinds.
You got it. Next, we thank you for that question and for your answer. And Jeremy Ike 6/1944 asks, for Tom, where are your retrodictions on the amount of needed beneficial mutations per year for 3 billion years? No numbers means your theory is not science.
I'd just go with whatever the academic consensus says. Just go ask the biologist. I'm not a biologist.
I'll have something to say to that. See, the thing is, he wants to present, you know, a model of pond scum to people evolution, but he hasn't really explained away any of the fatal blows to his evolutionary theory. And if you look at Haldane's dilemma, which is what somewhat of the question that he's asking, because you would need, like, let's look at apes to humans. There would need to be tens or even hundreds of millions of beneficial mutations that arose and then went to fixation. And I talked about this during our back and forth, during that time frame, that specific time frame. And that scenario would require roughly 1,000 independent beneficial fixations per generation. And that's literally impossible. Pond scum to people evolution is impossible. And that's why I always say, you know, that type of evolution is outside of just a normal change in allele frequencies and populations over time. It only happens in the minds of the evolutionists. They hope, they dream, they imagine. That's all I have to say.
Gotcha. Next.
Just a quick response to that. We actually have evidence. We can make future predictions. You can't. So more likely yours is the imaginary.
Next we have James Downard, who asks, question for Standing for Truth, please name any... Oh, that I already read that one. Sorry about that. Copy and pasted it twice, I think. Z Yonder asks, for Tom, are scientific theories fact?
Scientific theories are made of facts. Facts are parts of scientific theories, but there are some theories like the heliocentric theory, where the Earth revolves around the sun. That's a theory. The germ theory of disease is a theory. The atomic theory of mass, that's a theory. That's the things that calls nuclear bombs and nuclear power plants. Everything in science is a theory, but theories are made of facts.
Gotcha.
I would say that type of evolution, particles to people, goo to you type evolution, that's not even a theory. It's not even a good hypothesis. That's why I say it always just happens in the imagination of the evolution. But he said that, you know, we look at things, if you're looking at an assumption or a guess, and let's say a planet that he's talking about orbits the sun, we see the planet on different locations of the orbit in a year, and that's why we can tell it has an orbit and would start at one point and end on another. But that's observable. We can figure that out. But in regards to you know, your fish to fisherman evolution, we observe none of that. You know, it's not, like I said, it's just not even a good hypothesis. You actually need evidence to support it for it to become a theory.
Well, right. I just want to clarify that one point. The evidence is the future testable predictions. There are lots of things we can't directly observe, like photons and neutrinos and all kinds of tiny particles, but we make future indirect observations to verify those. And evolution is one of the most supported scientific theories ever. It has tons of these, more than essentially anything else. So it is pretty much on equal grounds as heliocentrism with the evidence. Direct observation is just irrelevant.
I mean, I don't want that question to go on forever. Obviously, I disagree. I think you could just rewatch the debate and see that there's just so much fatal blows to pawns come to people type evolution that it can't be possible. So even if you want to go to things like the fossil record, I mean, fossils are just circumstantial evidence requiring an actual theory to account for them. So I'm just going to stand by the fact that I don't even think it's a good hypothesis, let alone a theory.
Gotcha. Next question. Harry asks, can Christians be evolutionists, such as myself? So I think he's saying that he's a Christian who believes in evolution.
Is this for me?
Sure.
I think so.
I mean, I would say that just reading the Bible, using proper hermeneutics, proper exegesis, at the end of the day, you're not going to find ape to man type evolution in there. And it's just, I was talking about this the other day, and it's just bad theology. Young Earth creation has the best theology. Old Earth creation, theistic evolutionism, it's just bad theology. It's a lot of force fitting. The story doesn't flow nicely. And the thing is, if there's no first Adam, well, where's the need for the second Adam? And salvation is in Jesus Christ alone. By grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. But where's the necessity for salvation if there was no fall of man? So it's like I said, it's just bad. I don't know. That's a tough question because, that's really all I got to say to it. Tom, if you want to say something to it.
Well, yeah. Can you actually, it doesn't actually say, you can't assume that the Bible is perfectly literal in those. It could be figurative because there's lots of places where it is figurative. And so it's reasonable for certain Christians to take a figurative interpretation of that and assume it was done by evolution, right? That's potentially reasonable, even if you may not see it as the most.
I will say this, I will respect Old Earth, because a lot of the Old Earth creationists like Hugh Ross, they reject evolution and they still hold to a literal Adam and Eve in their theology, which makes sense because even they recognize that ignoring the reality of a literal Adam would actually take away from the necessity of the second Adam, which is Jesus Christ. So, and even I think as far as I've even heard that some theistic evolutionists are finding a way to put a literal Adam and Eve in their story, whether it's just one man, one woman coming out of a population of 10,000. as obviously the theory of evolution teaches, human evolution. So that would, I guess, still be somewhat consistent and allow you to look to Jesus Christ as the second Adam. So I know there's a lot of that going on. So I would say I respect that at least.
You betcha. Next question, and we don't have a ton of time yet, so I'm going to try to move quick through what we have. And sorry for those of you who asked if we don't get to it. So Rayrard asks, my question is to ask what the perfect created version of the CO1 mitochondrial gene is, and what genetic standard does he use to establish genetic entropy as fact?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of two questions. He says first, we can just go with the first one. Ask what the perfect created version of the CO1 mitochondrial gene is.
With the perfect version of it, like with no mutation accumulation?
That's my guess.
Yeah, I mean, my position is pretty simple. I mean, we were created with perfect genomes, and there's been a accumulation of mutations in mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA since the fall of man. And if you can look at this increased genetic entropy and take it back to a time of least genetic entropy, I mean, I think that's pretty obvious to conclude that would be a time of creation. And we see entropy not only in the genome, but we see it in the universe. So the second law of thermodynamics is the law of increasing entropy. So if everything's winding down, who winded up? Take that back to a point of least entropy in the universe. There's a point of creation, least entropy in the genome. There's a point of the creation of man and the created kind. So I think it flows perfectly well. Thanks. Good question.
Gotcha. You bet. And next, what genetic, he says like a two-parter really quick. What genetic standard does he use to establish genetic entropy as fact?
What standard do I ask that again?
What genetic standard does Standing for Truth use to establish genetic entropy as fact?
Well, the fact that nearly all non-neutral mutations are deleterious. We inherit a multitude of all old mutations, 100 to 300 per person per generation. That's 700 billion new mutations this generation. Natural selection is going to have to do something about it. So we start adding new mutations at the first division in pregnancy, obviously, and we die primarily due to mutation accumulation. We pass old and new mutations to our kids and grandkids. I mean, just looking at gene sequencing, mutations, the limits of natural selection, what beneficials actually do, how rare they are, epigenetics. There's a whole bunch of things that you can look at. I mean, population geneticists that aren't even creationists have always looked at this. That's why they have models, synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism. I would go look at those and see if you think those mechanisms will be able to explain the influx of deleterious mutations. I mean, the information's out there. I can't do all the homework for the evolutionists. Thanks, that's all I got.
Gotcha. And one last one. Jeremy Ike 1944 asks, there are more failed predictions. Let's see. I'm going to let the fact that it starts with a statement, but it's kind of a preface for the question, so I'll let it slide. There are far more failed predictions in evolutionary literature, such as, did they predict dinosaur soft tissue before they were found? If it's so obvious, why not predict it? I think that's for Tom.
Why didn't they predict that dinosaurs would have soft tissue? I'm pretty sure they did. I don't think they thought dinosaurs were all bone or hard tissue. But I mean, maybe he's asking about the thing where the T-Rex bone that had soft tissue inside of it. Well, I mean, you can just Google that. I mean, it's been answered by evolution, by scientists.
Gotcha.
I think I would say one thing, because he talked about, some testable, falsifiable predictions that have been verified. But the thing is, when these evolutionists are making just thousands and thousands of predictions, and there's so many failed predictions and so many fatal blows to the evolutionary theory, one or two is bound to come true. So that's just expected. But based on the amount that they actually make and the amount of failed ones there are, That's why I just say that, you can believe in it all you want, that type of evolution, but at the end of the day, it is a science fiction religion, and I think the word science has been hijacked by the evolutionists to try and make people think that that type of evolution is actually in the realm of empirical science. Thanks.
Gotcha. We, with that, want to say thank you for all of your questions.
Oh wait, actually, do we have time for one more? Because I'd like to ask Stanley the question.
If standing is okay with it, we are kind of going on time. We are past time. We're significantly past the time that
I think it was a good, respectable, profitable discussion. I kind of like talking to Tom. So yeah, go ahead, ask me a question, brother. One last question.
So you believe in Noah's Ark, and there is a certain number of kinds on Noah's Ark. I'd guess probably around 7,000, just to throw a number out. And right now, there's currently about 6.5 million species of animals that live on land. That means that approximately 4 species would have to be created every single day, which by species I just mean about like several 100,000 differences in the genetic code. So is that an accurate representation of your theory, that you believe that there are a certain number of kinds on the Ark, like 7,000, and there's currently about 6.5 million estimated species? So that would mean that
are you asking me how can you get that amount of species in 4,000 years?
Right, because there'd have to be at least like 10,000 differences per day.
Yeah, I actually, that was a big portion of my opening with the created heterozygosity hypothesis. If you've got these heterozygous ancestors that God encoded with these pre-existing functional DNA differences, because we know there's millions and millions of DNA differences, nuclear DNA differences that separate species and families. So if those are encoded by God at the start of their existence, an almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are actually possible. So when you look to that model, we don't just look to mutations there, Tom. We look to recombination, gene conversion. They're going to provide many new varieties of these combinations of traits that I'm talking about quickly, since the differences are already built in. So it makes testable, falsifiable predictions that I've talked about earlier.
My question was a little bit different. I was asking because in order to account for those species, you would need to have 4 new species every day. And a new species, I'm simply just defining it as something that has hundreds of thousands of genetic differences, which means in order to account for these new species, you need hundreds of thousands of differences every day. Your theory seems to have a much greater evolution than ours.
I just don't think you understand what I mean by built-in genetic differences. There's millions of DNA differences in the nuclear DNA. So if these were built in at creation, created heterozygosity hypothesis, obviously through recombination and gene conversion, these new traits, new species would come about quickly, especially post-creation, immediate post-creation, post-flood.
I think you're saying that it's pre-programmed, that the species are pre-programmed into the DNA?
The genetic diversity is pre-programmed. Actually, there's a paper out. I would recommend you look at it. It's a fulfilled prediction from, based on the created heterozygosity hypothesis. It's about finches, because we predict shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity, right? Heterozygous DNA sites to more homozygous DNA sites would produce new species quickly, even in observed time. So we've seen just recently, observed time, new finch species came about through shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. So because we've just studied speciation and speciation events recently, the more that we do study, that's another testable prediction. There's going to be more observed cases like these finches, many more. But the thing is, it has slowed down since the flood. So there's certain rates, mutation rates, predictions have been made. I would just tell people to read Replacing Darwin, very, very complex technical book, but it's all there. It's very fascinating.
Very interesting.
I'm winded after that, so that's good.
We have a couple of house cleaning things to quick mention. First, Steve is hurt that no one wants to debate him on agnosticism on this channel. And he's been looking hard, I've been looking hard. I've seen that both Steve and I usually get the same response, because I saw it on Twitter at least once, where basically Steve says, hey, do you want to debate me on this issue, namely on whether or not agnosticism really fits under the definition of atheism according to actual philosophers. And thanks for offering, Richard. I think that it's more like Steve takes the position that agnosticism does not fit under the umbrella of atheism in the scholarly literature of philosophy. And like a lot of people are like, oh, totally does. And then Steve's like, okay, great, let's debate it. And they're like, nah. So it's been really hard. And I'm not trying to insinuate that that view is wrong. I'm just trying to like suggest that it has been really hard to find somebody that will debate Steve and oppose his claim that most scholars of philosophy, atheists or Christians, whatever they are, most of them would say that atheism and agnosticism, that they don't fit under the same umbrella. And so, namely that atheism isn't just a lack of belief. That's Steve's position that he's wanting to debate. And so shoot me an email if you want to debate him, because that one's been freaking hard to find somebody. And then next, we are going to discuss the fact that we have a couple of exciting upcoming debates this week. One of them this Tuesday with the, some would call him notorious, some would call him heroic, whatever you want to call him, praise I am that I am. Definitely, he's got some energy, and he's coming to debate on Tuesday, and that's with the not frustrated atheist, raging atheist. So that's going to be exciting. And moreover, tomorrow we will have a debate on God's existence, and that is going to be a surprise debate. We're not telling you who, but it's going to be fun. I'm very, very excited. So, debaters, we can't thank you enough for using your time, like donating your time basically to everybody, sharing what you've read on this channel. And so we want to say thanks to the debaters, and highly encourage everybody, if you enjoyed what you heard, or if you didn't enjoy, you can still check out their links. That way you can at least hear it straight from them. And with that, debaters, do you have any last goodbyes you want to say as well?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thanks for standing to come and debate. It was an enjoyable debate. I'd like, can you email me that book about the heterozygosity and the pre-programmed species thing? I'd like to read that. But yeah, thanks for having me on, and thanks for debating, Standing.
No problem. Yeah, thanks for having me on, James. It's always a pleasure. I really, really enjoyed debating Tom today. I think it was good. I'm glad there's 120 people watching. And yeah, I'd be more than happy to send you that book. It's probably the most up-to-date book on young Earth creation research. All the testable predictions I've talked about are in there. So if you were to read that, and then maybe we could have another talk one day on that specifically, that'd be awesome.
Very exciting. So I can't tell everybody like what some of these secrets are. We hopefully will have these debaters back, which could be a secret in a way. We don't have it planned yet, but we'd love to have both of them back. They're both fun. We know for sure Tom's coming back later this month for Inspiring Philosophy. And then our dear Standing for Truth, he's a regular. He loves to debate, so we would love to have him back. And in addition to that, thanks for your plug, Mark Caesar. We appreciate your support. We have a couple of like secret debates that we're like, I'm talking to people and I'm like, hey, you think this might work? And we're getting some response that one of them I'm like near certain it's going to work out, and we got some big ones that we're really excited about. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. Hopefully you make it. But anyway, with that, if you want to be sure that you see those, hit the subscribe button and that little bell notification so you for sure know when we're live. By the way, with that, we want to say thanks for stopping by, and keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Have a great night.